The morning sun filtered through the kitchen window as Jake Mitchell sat at his small wooden table, staring at the "room for rent" sign he had just finished making. His calloused hands, weathered from years of construction work, traced the edges of the cardboard. The house felt too quiet without the sound of his 8-year-old daughter Emma's laughter echoing through the halls. Emma had moved in with her mother 3 states away just 2 months ago, following a custody arrangement that left Jake with an empty bedroom and a heart that felt just as hollow. The decision had been practical, his ex-wife had argued. Better schools, more opportunities, a stable home with her new husband who worked in finance. Jake couldn't argue with the logic, even though it tore him apart inside. Now, sitting in the silence of his modest 2-bedroom house on Maple Street, Jake knew he needed to make a change. The mortgage payments weren't getting any smaller, and his construction job, while steady, barely covered the expenses of a house that had been meant for a family. Renting out Emma's room seemed like the most sensible solution, even though the thought of a stranger living in his daughter's space made his chest tighten. Jake had spent the weekend preparing the room. He had carefully packed away Emma's stuffed animals, her drawings from art class, and the fairy lights she had begged him to hang around her window. The room now looked clean and neutral, with fresh white paint on the walls and a simple twin bed with crisp blue sheets. But no matter how much he cleaned, he could still smell the faint scent of her strawberry shampoo lingering in the air. The doorbell rang at exactly 10 o'clock, interrupting his thoughts. Jake smoothed down his flannel shirt and walked to the front door, taking a deep breath before opening it. Standing on his doorstep was a young woman who looked to be in her early 20s, with long blonde hair pulled back in a simple ponytail and bright green eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. "Hi," she said, offering a warm smile. "I'm Sarah. I called about the room." Jake nodded, stepping aside to let her in. "Jake Mitchell, come on in." He noticed she carried only a small backpack and wore clothes that looked expensive, though she seemed to be trying to dress down. Her jeans were designer, and her simple white t-shirt had the kind of perfect fit that suggested it cost more than Jake spent on clothes in a month. "This is a lovely neighborhood," Sarah said as she looked around the living room. The space was clean but clearly lived in, with a comfortable couch that had seen better days and family photos scattered on the mantelpiece. Her eyes lingered on a picture of Jake and Emma at the local carnival, both grinning widely with cotton candy in their hands. "Yeah, it's quiet. Good people around here," Jake replied, leading her down the hallway. "The room's back here. It's not huge, but it gets good morning light." He opened the door to Emma's former bedroom, and Sarah stepped inside. The room was small but cozy, with a window that overlooked the backyard where Jake had built Emma a tire swing that still hung from the old oak tree. "It's perfect," Sarah said softly, and Jake was surprised to hear genuine warmth in her voice. "How much are you asking for rent?" Jake had spent hours researching rental prices in the area, trying to find the balance between what he needed and what seemed fair. $400 a month, plus split utilities. There's a shared bathroom down the hall, and you can use the kitchen whenever you want. Sarah nodded without hesitation. "That sounds very reasonable. When can I move in?" Most people would have asked to see the bathroom, or inquired about parking, or wanted to know about house rules. Sarah's quick acceptance caught Jake off guard, but he wasn't about to question good luck. "Whenever you're ready, I guess. First month's rent up front, if that works for you." "Of course." Sarah reached into her backpack and pulled out an envelope. "I hope cash is okay. I have exactly $400 here." Jake stared at the envelope. In his experience, college students usually needed to scramble to come up with rent money, counting out crumpled bills and loose change. This envelope looked crisp and new, like she had just visited the bank. "Cash is fine," he said, taking the money. "Can I ask what you're studying?" "Business," Sarah replied quickly. "At the community college downtown. I'm trying to gain some real-world experience, you know. Live independently for a while." There was something in the way she said it that made Jake curious, but he didn't press. Everyone had their reasons for the choices they made, and he respected privacy. "Well, you'll get plenty of independence here. I work construction, so I'm usually out by 6 in the morning. I try to keep things quiet in the evenings." "That sounds perfect. I'm an early riser myself." Sarah walked to the window and looked out at the backyard. "Is that your daughter's swing?" Jake felt his throat tighten. "Yeah, Emma. She lives with her mom now." "I'm sorry," Sarah said, and her voice carried a gentleness that surprised him. "That must be really hard." "It is what it is," Jake replied, though his voice betrayed the pain he tried to keep hidden. "She's better off where she is. Better opportunities and all that." Sarah turned from the window, and Jake caught a flicker of something in her expression, understanding, maybe, or recognition of a pain she knew herself. Sometimes the people who love us most make sacrifices we don't fully understand until we're older. The comment was surprisingly mature for someone her age, and Jake found himself studying her face more carefully. There was something about Sarah that didn't quite add up. She spoke with the confidence of someone much older, and despite her casual clothes, everything about her suggested a background very different from the typical college student struggling to make ends meet. "I'll let you get settled in," Jake said, stepping toward the door. "I usually keep to myself, but if you need anything, just let me know." "Actually," Sarah said, "would it be okay if I cooked dinner sometime? I love to cook, and it's more fun when you're cooking for someone else." Jake paused. He had been living on frozen dinners and takeout since Emma left, too tired after long days at work sites to bother with real meals. "You don't need to do that. I'd like to, if you don't mind. Consider it my way of saying thank you for giving me a chance." There was something earnest in her request that made Jake nod. "Okay, that would be nice, actually." Over the next few weeks, Jake found himself looking forward to coming home in a way he hadn't since Emma had moved away. Sarah was a quiet roommate, but her presence made the house feel alive again. She kept her word about cooking, preparing meals that were far more sophisticated than anything Jake had ever attempted. She seemed to have an unlimited budget for groceries, always insisting that she enjoyed shopping for ingredients and that Jake shouldn't worry about the cost. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" Jake asked one evening as they sat down to a dinner of herb-crusted salmon with roasted vegetables. Sarah smiled, but there was something guarded in her expression. "My grandmother taught me." She believed that cooking was one of the most important life skills anyone could have. "Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman." She was. Sarah's voice grew softer. "She used to say that food was how you showed people you cared about them. That anyone could buy an expensive gift, but taking the time to prepare something with your own hands, that meant something different." Jake found himself sharing more than he had intended over these dinners. He told Sarah about his job, about the satisfaction he found in building things that would last. He talked about Emma, about how proud he was of her intelligence and creativity, and how much he missed their weekend adventures exploring local parks and museums. "You're a good father," Sarah said one evening as they cleaned dishes together. "Emma is lucky to have someone who loves her so much." "Sometimes I wonder if love is enough," Jake admitted. "Her stepfather can give her things I never could. Piano lessons, summer camps, college funds. All I could offer her was time and attention. Those might be the most valuable things of all," Sarah replied quietly. As autumn settled over Maple Street, Jake began to notice small details about his tenant that didn't quite fit with her story. Sarah's laptop was top of the line, and she seemed to have video calls at odd hours with people who spoke in business terminology that sounded far beyond community college level. She received packages occasionally, always expensive-looking items that she would quickly take to her room without explanation. One Saturday morning, Jake was working in his garage when he heard Sarah on the phone in the backyard. Her voice carried through the open window, and he couldn't help but overhear fragments of conversation. "No, Dad, I'm not ready to come back yet. I understand the board meeting is important, but this is important to me too. I'm learning things here that I never would have learned in the boardroom." Jake felt a chill run down his spine. Board meetings weren't typically part of a community college student's vocabulary. He tried to push away the growing suspicion that Sarah wasn't who she claimed to be, but the pieces were starting to form a picture he wasn't sure he wanted to see clearly. That evening, Sarah seemed quieter than usual as she prepared dinner. Jake watched her move around the kitchen with practiced efficiency, and he made a decision that had been building in his mind for weeks. "Sarah," he said carefully, "can I ask you something?" She looked up from the stove, her green eyes wary. "Of course. Are you really a community college student?" The wooden spoon in Sarah's hand stopped moving, and Jake saw her shoulders tense. For a long moment, the only sound in the kitchen was the gentle simmering of the sauce on the stove. "What makes you ask that?" she said finally. "Little things. Your laptop, your phone calls, the way you talk about business. And the groceries you buy cost more than most students spend on food in a month." Sarah turned off the burner and leaned against the counter, her arms crossed. "You're very observant. I work with my hands, but I'm not stupid." "I never thought you were stupid," Sarah said quickly. "In fact, you're one of the smartest people I've met in a long time." Jake waited, giving her space to explain. Sarah sighed deeply. "My name is Sarah, but my last name isn't what I told you when I moved in." It's Montgomery. My father is Richard Montgomery. The name hit Jake like a physical blow. Richard Montgomery owned Montgomery Industries, one of the largest construction and development companies in the state. Jake had worked on several Montgomery projects over the years, always as a subcontractor hired by smaller firms. The Montgomery name was synonymous with wealth and power in their city. "You're Richard Montgomery's daughter," Jake said slowly. "Yes." Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper. "I graduated from Harvard Business School 6 months ago, and I'm supposed to start working at my father's company next month. But I've spent my whole life in boardrooms and country clubs, and I realized I didn't know anything about the real world. About how real people live and work and struggle." Jake felt a mixture of emotions washing over him: confusion, betrayal, and strangely, a deep sadness. "So this has all been what? Some kind of social experiment?" "No." Sarah stepped toward him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "It started that way, I admit. I wanted to understand what it meant to live on a budget, to worry about rent money, to work for everything you have. But it became something much more important than that. What? It became the first time in my life that someone cared about me for who I am, not what my last name could do for them." Sarah's voice cracked slightly. "Do you have any idea what it's like to never know if people like you or if they like your father's money?" Jake stared at her, processing this revelation. The young woman standing in his kitchen, with tears threatening to spill down her cheeks, suddenly looked very different from the confident college student he had thought she was. She looked vulnerable and lost, despite all the privilege that surrounded her. "The way you talk about Emma," Sarah continued, "the way you light up when you mention her, the way you worry about whether you're enough for her, that's real love. That's what I've been searching for my whole life. Not someone who wants to marry into the Montgomery fortune, but someone who would love me if I had nothing." "Sarah," Jake began, but she held up her hand. "I know you probably hate me now for lying to you. And I understand if you want me to leave. But I want you to know that these past few months have been the happiest I've ever been. Cooking dinner for someone who appreciates it, talking with someone who listens to my ideas instead of just nodding because of who my father is, living in a house that feels like a home instead of a museum, it's everything I never knew I wanted." Jake walked to the kitchen window and looked out at Emma's swing, moving slightly in the evening breeze. He thought about the conversations he'd had with Sarah, the way she'd listened when he talked about missing his daughter, the way she'd made this empty house feel warm again. "I don't hate you," he said finally, turning back to face her. "I'm hurt that you felt you had to lie, but I think I understand why you did. You do. When Emma was little, she used to pretend to be different people sometimes. She'd make up whole stories about being a princess or a superhero or just a regular kid whose parents weren't divorced. I asked her once why she did it, and she said sometimes it was easier to be someone else when being yourself felt too complicated." Sarah wiped away a tear that had escaped down her cheek. "That's exactly how it feels." Jake leaned against the counter, studying her face. "So what happens now? Do you go back to your father's company and pretend these months never happened?" "I don't know," Sarah admitted. "My father has been calling constantly, demanding that I come home. He thinks this whole thing is just a phase, some kind of rebellion that I'll get out of my system. But I've learned things here that I could never learn in a boardroom." "Like what?" "Like how much strength it takes to get up every morning and work hard for your family, even when everything feels stacked against you. Like how much courage it takes to put your child's needs before your own, even when it breaks your heart. Like how kindness and integrity matter more than money or power." Jake felt something shift in his chest, a warmth he hadn't experienced in months. "You learned all that just from renting a room?" "I learned it from watching you," Sarah said simply. "You work harder than anyone I've ever known, and you never complain. You talk about Emma with so much love and pride, even though missing her is obviously killing you. And you opened your home to a stranger because you needed the money, but you've been nothing but kind and respectful, even though I'm sure I'm not the roommate you were expecting." Jake found himself smiling despite the complexity of the situation. "You're definitely not what I was expecting." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, the weight of Sarah's revelation settling between them. "Can I ask you something?" Sarah said. "Sure. If you had known who I really was when I answered your ad, would you have rented me the room?" Jake considered the question honestly. "Probably not. I would have assumed you were slumming it, or that you'd cause problems I couldn't afford to deal with. And now I think you're someone who's trying to figure out who she wants to be, separate from who she's expected to be. That takes courage." Sarah smiled, the first genuine smile Jake had seen from her since their conversation began. "What would you do if you were me?" I think, Jake said slowly, you need to decide what kind of person you want to be, and then figure out how to be that person with or without your father's company. But you should probably have that conversation with him honestly, instead of just avoiding his calls. You're right, Sarah nodded. I owe him that much, and I owe myself the chance to see if we can find a middle ground. For what it's worth, Jake said, I think any company would be lucky to have someone who cares as much about people as you do. The next morning, Sarah knocked on Jake's bedroom door earlier than usual. When he opened it, she was dressed in a sharp business suit that reminded him immediately of who she really was. I'm going to see my father today, she said. I want to talk to him about working for the company, but on my terms. And I want to tell him about what I've learned here. That sounds like a good plan. Jake, she said, hesitating. Would it be okay if I kept the room for a while longer? Even if I start working for my father, I'd like to keep living here. If you'll have me. Jake felt something ease in his chest. I'd like that. And maybe, when Emma comes to visit, I could cook dinner for all of us. I'd love to meet her. The thought of Emma's reaction to Sarah's elaborate cooking brought a smile to Jake's face. She'd love that. Fair warning, though, she's got strong opinions about everything, and she's not easily impressed. Sounds like she takes after her father, Sarah said with a grin. 3 weeks later, Jake came home from work to find Sarah in the kitchen, but she wasn't alone. A man in an expensive suit stood near the counter, and Jake recognized him immediately from newspaper photos. Richard Montgomery was shorter than Jake had expected, with graying hair and eyes the same green as his daughter's. Dad, this is Jake, Sarah said, and Jake caught the nervous edge in her voice. Jake, this is my father. Richard Montgomery stepped forward, extending his hand. Mr. Mitchell, I've been wanting to meet you. Jake shook the offered hand, noting that despite his wealth, Montgomery had a firm, working man's grip. Mr. Montgomery, my daughter tells me you've been a good influence on her, Montgomery said, and there was something in his tone that Jake couldn't quite read. She's been a good influence on me too, Jake replied honestly. Montgomery nodded, looking around the modest kitchen. She also tells me you're one of the best construction supervisors in the city. I've been looking over some of the projects you've worked on. Impressive quality. Jake felt Sarah's eyes on him and wondered where this conversation was heading. I have a proposition for you, Montgomery continued. My daughter has convinced me to try a new approach with some of our residential developments. Smaller communities, affordable housing that's built to last. We need someone to oversee the construction, someone who understands quality workmanship and treats every project like they're building a home for their own family. Jake stared at the older man. Are you offering me a job? I'm offering you a chance to run your own construction company, with Montgomery Industries as your primary client. You'd have full control over hiring, scheduling, and quality standards. The pay would be considerably more than what you're making now. Jake glanced at Sarah, who was watching the exchange with bright eyes. This was your idea. I told my father that I'd learned more about business in 2 months.